Hello, everyone, and welcome to our channel English Logic Studio. I'm your host, Anna, and today we're going to talk about something really fun and practical. We're diving into how two friends plan a weekend trip together. This is such a common situation, and it's packed with useful English phrases and vocabulary that you can use in real life. Joining me today is my good friend James, who's also an English teacher. James, thanks for being here.
Hey Anna, it's great to be back. Weekend trips are one of my favorite things to talk about because there's so much to explore, both literally and language-wise. I'm excited to help our listeners today.
Absolutely. So imagine two friends, let's call them Alex and Sarah, who want to plan a weekend getaway. They're going through all the steps together. First, they need to decide where to go. James, what phrases do you think they'd use at this stage?
Well, they definitely start with suggestions. Phrases like, "How about going to the beach?" or "What do you think of visiting the mountains?" are super common. The key here is the phrase, "How about?" which we use to propose an idea. It's friendly and casual. For example, "How about we leave on Friday morning?" which means you're suggesting a specific time. Another one is, "What do you think of?" which invites an opinion. Like, "What do you think of camping?" which means you want to know their feelings about that idea.
That's perfect. And I want to point out that learners sometimes mix up how about with what about. They're similar, but what about is often used to introduce a new topic or problem. Like if someone says, "I'm tired of cities," you might respond, "What about the countryside?" which means you're suggesting an alternative. So in planning, if Alex says, "I don't want to drive too far," Sarah could say, "What about that nearby lake?" which means she's proposing a closer option. James, can you give us another example of suggestion phrases?
Sure. Another great phrase is, "Why don't we?" which is also a suggestion but sounds a bit more proactive. Like, "Why don't we look at train schedules?" which means you're proposing an action to take. It's softer than saying, "We should," because it feels more like a team decision. For instance, instead of "we should book tickets," saying, "Why don't we book tickets today?" makes it more collaborative. And learners often forget that this is a full phrase, not just "why not." So you wouldn't say, "Why not book tickets?" in this context, because that sounds like you're questioning why they haven't done it yet.
Exactly, and that's a common mistake. Why not is for challenging something like, why not go by bus, meaning you're questioning the choice. But why don't we is for suggesting. Now, once they have some ideas, they need to discuss and agree. James, what phrases come next?
Then they move to agreeing or disagreeing politely. For agreement, phrases like, "That sounds perfect," or "I'm totally on board with that," work well. On board with means you agree and support the idea. For example, if Sarah suggests, "Let's go hiking," Alex could say, "I'm on board with that," which means he fully agrees. For disagreement, it's important to be polite. Instead of, "No, I hate hiking," you'd say, "I'm not sure about hiking," or "I'd prefer something else." The phrase, "I'd prefer," is gentle. Like, "I'd prefer a relaxing."
And I want to add that I'd rather is useful here too. I'd rather stay in a hotel than camp means you strongly prefer one option. Learners sometimes confuse prefer and rather. Remember, prefer is followed by to, like I prefer to drive, and rather is often followed by then for comparison. So I'd rather drive than fly shows your choice. James, can you give us a practical example of a disagreement in trip planning?
Of course. Imagine Alex says, "How about we go to a music festival?" and Sarah isn't keen. She could respond, "I'm not sure about that because it might be too crowded. I prefer something quieter, like a small town." This shows she's disagreeing but offering an alternative. The key is explaining your reason briefly. Another polite phrase is, "That's a good idea, but," which softens the disagreement. Like, "That's a good idea, but I'm worried about the cost." This way, you're acknowledging their suggestion before sharing your concern.
Beautiful. Now, once they agree on a destination, they need to plan the logistics. That means details like transportation and accommodation. James, what vocabulary is essential here?
First, they talk about the itinerary. That's a fancy word for the plan of activities. Pronounce it slowly, itinerary. It means the schedule of what you'll do each day. For example, our itinerary includes hiking on Saturday and visiting a museum on Sunday. Learners often mispronounce this as itinerary instead of itinerary. Another key term is booking, which means reserving something in advance. Like, I'll book the hotel room, or we need to book train tickets. Then there's accommodation, which is where you'll stay, like hotels, hostels, or Airbnb.
And I should mention that accommodation is uncountable, so you wouldn't say accommodations. You'd say, we need to find accommodation, or what accommodation options are there? Another important phrase is check-in and check-out. Check-in is when you arrive and register at your accommodation, and check-out is when you leave. For example, our hotel check-in is at 3 p.m., which means we can get the room at that time. James, what phrases would they use for scheduling?
They'd use time-related phrases like, we should leave by 8 a.m., which means departure should happen no later than that time. Or, let's aim to arrive around noon, which means you hope to get there at approximately that time. The phrase aim to is useful because it shows it's a goal but not fixed. Another one is, what time works for you, which is asking for their preference. For instance, what time works for you to leave on Friday? Means you're considering their schedule. Learners sometimes say, what time are you free? Which is okay but less specific for planning.
Good point. And for activities, they might discuss sightseeing, which means visiting interesting places. Like, we can do some sightseeing on Saturday afternoon. Or hiking, which means walking in nature. James, let's talk about packing. What phrases come up there?
Packing is all about preparing. Phrases like, don't forget to pack, are common. For example, don't forget to pack a raincoat, which is a reminder. Or, make sure you bring, like, make sure you bring comfortable shoes. The difference is, pack is for putting in the suitcase, and bring means to have it with you. Learners sometimes mix them up. Another phrase is, what should I pack, which is asking for advice. And essentials are things you absolutely need, like travel essentials include a passport and phone charger.
And I think it's important to mention layers, which means wearing multiple clothes you can remove or add. Like pack layers because the weather changes, which means bring a t-shirt, sweater, and jacket. Now, let's address common mistakes. One big one is using travel and trip incorrectly. Travel is the general activity, like I love travel, while trip is a specific journey, like our weekend trip. So you wouldn't say, I'm going on a travel this weekend. James, another mistake?
Yes, with book and reserve. They're similar, but book is more common for flights and hotels, while reserve is often for tables at restaurants or special items. Like book the flight, but reserve a table. Learners might say reserve the flight, which sounds odd. Also, with time phrases, avoid saying I will be there at 3 p.m. sharp, unless you mean exactly that time. Sharp means precisely on time, so it's better to say around 3 p.m. if you're flexible.
Excellent tips. Now, for remembering these phrases, I suggest creating a mini dialogue. Practice with a friend about planning a pretend trip. Use phrases like, how about, I'd prefer, and don't forget to pack. James, what's your tip?
My tip is to use sticky notes. Write phrases like check-in or book tickets on notes and put them where you'll see them daily. Also, listen for these phrases in movies or podcasts about travel. When you hear them, pause and repeat. For example, if a character says, let's book the hotel, say it out loud yourself. This builds muscle memory for speaking.
That's so practical. So to wrap up, planning a weekend trip involves suggesting ideas, agreeing politely, discussing logistics like accommodation and scheduling, and remembering packing essentials. We've covered phrases like, how about, I'd prefer, check-in, and don't forget to pack. These are tools you can use in many situations, not just trips. James, any final thoughts?
Just that practice makes perfect. Don't worry about mistakes. Everyone makes them when learning. The key is to try using these phrases in real conversations. even if it's just texting a friend about weekend plans. Happy planning and happy learning.